that that should actually say building communication strategies, plural. Because one of the things I hope to try and persuade you of is that you are going to need more than one communication strategy. This is not a case of one size fits all. However, before you even get to that, the first thing you have to decide is why you are communicating. Now, that might actually sound like quite a silly question, but it isn't. And the reason for that is that there are quite a lot of people, or groups, who don't communicate at all. Their strategy is not to communicate. Perhaps the most obvious in the public sector, or in the civil society sector, is the International Committee of the Red Cross. They do their work by not communicating, except with very, very specific groups within military and within societies. There are companies who also don't communicate. It was said after the oil spill, BP oil spill crisis in the Gulf of Mexico, that BP's communication strategy at that point was not to say anything in as many different languages as possible. So not saying something is a valid communication strategy, but I don't think it's appropriate for you. But you have to decide why you are communicating. A lot of people communicate simply to make themselves visible. Soap stars, right? They build their reputation simply by being famous for being famous, yeah? You've all heard that one. Okay. They simply want to build their brand and be visible. Now, I think you're a little bit more substantial than that. Probably number two is getting closer to you. Changing views and changing behaviour. Now, that's not just changing the views of the general public. It can be changing the views and the behaviour of policymakers. Perhaps they don't support you. Perhaps they're even opposed to you. And you want to move them certainly from neutral to positive, or at the very least, anti to neutral. Public education. That's a slight variation on changing views and behaviour. You want the public to start to learn a bit more and to start thinking differently. Fundraising. This is a very important one. This is one of the reasons that the ILO does a lot of communications. We need governments to support and fund our work. So if they don't know what we're doing, they're unlikely to go on giving us money. So we have to continue putting ourselves out there and promoting our work so that our funding continues. And there may be other reasons. If you're a politician, you're communicating because you want people to vote for you. If you're Coca-Cola, you're communicating because you want people to think, first of all, you're a good corporate citizen, and secondly, you want them to buy your product. There are many reasons. You have to decide what it is that you want if you're going to be successful. And to do that, you need a strategy. You can't just go out there and start throwing communications around, because it's like a bad meal. You know, none of the ingredients go together, and you end up with nothing. So what is a good strategy? The first thing you need is a diagnosis of your problem. And for that, you have to do really what you've been doing this week, which is sit down and take a long, hard view at what you've been doing and the strengths and the weaknesses of the idea. Because if you don't understand what the weaknesses of your idea are, then you're never going to sell it to other people. You don't have to tell them, but you need to know. So you need to diagnose the nature of your challenge, simplify it down as much as you can to the real core of that, and identify which are the really critical aspects. You then need to align that with a guiding policy. Now, this is not the same as a work plan. A guiding policy is your overall approach. It should be the thing that creates a consistent way of working, identifies the obstacles or the issues that you have to tackle, and will underlie your consistent voice, so that you're always saying essentially the same message. Because remember, saying the same thing is not boring, it's consistent. And it means that you really believe that what you're saying is correct. Now, if you get number one and number two right, the diagnosis and the guiding policy, then finding coherent actions will flow from that without too much difficulty, because they will be in line with number 1 and number 2, and they will be coordinated. After you have done 1, 2, and 3, then we move on to the tactics, which is exactly how you're going to do it, and that's what we'll be looking at later with a little exercise. But before we move on from strategy, because a lot of rot is talked about strategy, particularly people who like reading business books and business coverage in the papers, yeah, about management and, you know, 7 ways to be a perfect manager, or 7 ways to be a great boss, or 7 ways to be a fantastic employee. You get muddled up with what strategy is and what strategy isn't. And this is what strategy is not. Mission statements. Mission statements are as common as leaves on a tree now, aren't they? Everybody's got one. Some people have got more than one, and that's really worrying. Visions, the same thing. And statements of goals. Those are all things that talk about where you want to be, but they're not going to help you get there. A lot of them are really little more than fantasy. Before you start on your communication strategy, you need to make 5 decisions. Who do you want to talk to? And the more that you can boil that down to a specific group, the more successful you're likely to be. You've already done an exercise about talking to policymakers and convincing them. So you'll already know that the messages and the arguments that work for one group won't necessarily work for another group. So you need to decide who your audience is and who you need to reach. And then why do you need to reach them? What do you want them to do or not do? What behaviour do you want them to change? The third thing is the message. What do you want them to remember? What message is appropriate? The channels. Which communication channels are most likely to reach your audience? If it's a minister, it might be a face-to-face meeting. If it's members of the public, you probably have to break it down into smaller groups. If you want to meet women, maybe you have to go to some sort of social occasion. If you want to meet men, maybe you have to go somewhere where they gather. Children, again, teachers, professional groups, they will all have different channels of communication which are good for reaching them. It's the same also with, if you think about it, with television programs and the mass media. Different people listen to different programs. So if you're an advertiser and you're trying to sell a product that appeals only to men, you will advertise in the middle of the sports channels. If you want to sell makeup or perfume, you may advertise in the middle of a soap opera. It's all channels for audiences. And the final thing, which is very important, is how do you know if you've succeeded? It's not so easy with social protection. If you're selling Coca-Cola, you just look to see if your sales have gone up. But with something like this, which is very long-term, you need to find a way of showing that you've succeeded. Now, what I want to do now is show you a little video. Who here is familiar with the term PSA? Anybody? Hands up? Okay, PSA is a public service announcement. Basically, it's an advert usually made by the government to try and change your behaviour. Yeah, they're called different things, yeah? They might be about stopping smoking, or sending your kids to school, or brushing your teeth, all sorts of things. This one is from Australia, and what I'd like to do is show it to you, and then we can go through these 5 decisions, or 5 points. So what do you think? But tell me, where do you think that PSA appeals to? Does it appeal to here, or does it appeal there? There. How much information does it actually give you? A lot or a little? A little, yeah. Does that take away from its effectiveness? See, the point about this is that it actually hasn't given you that much concrete information, and yet for the audience that it's appealing to, they will probably remember that for quite a long time once they've seen that. and the likelihood of them taking on board the message is pretty high. So the point I want you to remember from that is that giving people a lot of information is not necessarily what is going to be most effective in getting your message across. A couple of key things is what you're after. Because people don't remember figures and statistics so much if you're talking to a general audience. If you're talking to a minister, it's slightly different. But if you want people to remember in here as well as up here, then pick your information very carefully. But let's go back to the 5 points. Question.
Regarding the messages being taken, because it is a very sort of type of message that addresses the emotional side and doesn't give a lot of statistical information and so on. And I remember a lot of the type of advertisement that is done in relation to drug use or tobacco, and those very graphic images of terrible lungs and all the effects that tobacco can have. And some people saying this is too scary and that actually can put people off. I always wonder what is the evidence about these type of messages, and are they really effective in changing behaviors?
Well, that's actually one reason why evaluation is so important, because you're quite right, it isn't. I mean, there was a case that they did in the United Kingdom. They took young people who'd got into trouble with the law, and they took them into prisons to show them what prison was like. And they thought that would be a deterrent. And in fact, it had the opposite effect. So, yeah, and if you make it too scary, people don't identify because they go like, it's not going to happen to me. But I think in this case, people do identify. But you would have to find an evaluation mechanism to make sure that was indeed happening. And I mean, we can move on to that. What would be the obvious evaluation mechanism for this? I mean, it's an advertisement which is designed to stop people drinking and driving. So, if you were going to put it out, and if you were going to evaluate, you might see if the number of arrests for drinking and driving went down in a specific area. That would be one way of doing it. Yeah. Let's just go back to the audience for a sec. Who do you think is the audience for this ad?
Those who drink and drive. Sorry? Those who drink and drive.
Yeah, perhaps even a bit more specific than that. The main character. Who is the main character? Man. A man, yeah? Yeah. Okay. What kind of man?
Young man.
Young man. And then what happened in the story?
Built guilty until he died.
No, but to the man.
Yeah?
What happens to the man in the story?
Regret.
Yes, he gets older, but the little boy doesn't go away. So when he's an older man, he's remembering a stupid mistake he made, probably when he's in his 20s. The behavior change is pretty obvious, right? Don't drink and drive. But actually, it's a bit more subtle than that again. What's the message at the end? Is it don't drink and drive? No. It says only a little bit over. So what channels would you put this out on? What channels? Where? Yeah?
Channels.
I don't mean TV channels, but like where would you place it if you wanted to reach that target audience?
At the bars where young men hang out.
Any other ideas?
Schools.
Sports, yeah, sports places. I mean, that's where guys go to have a couple of beers with their chums, isn't it? So you see, these are all very specific channels. I mean, there wouldn't be any point in putting this ad out probably at a time of children's TV, because it would frighten the children and he wouldn't reach your target audience. Or in the middle of the afternoon in a society where most women are, the audience of TV in the afternoon is mostly women. What you want is the male audience. And the reason I'm showing you this is that it's just to show you how you need to identify the channel, how you need to get your message tailored to exactly your group, and to find an evaluation mechanism. So there's your 5 decisions before you start. And to help you with that, when we do our exercise a little later on, I'm going to give you one of these. And you can see how you fill it in. You decide what your strategic objective is. In this case, it might be stop road deaths caused by young men who drink. That's your target audience. Your behavior change. The message, the takeaway message, which is you can be a little bit over and you can still kill people. Your supporting information. Now, you wouldn't necessarily use that on a video, but in a lot of other communication channels, you might use that. Say, for example, you were doing a leaflet, or you had a one-on-one with the minister, or you had a conference. You would want the supporting information. That would be data, statistics, something like that to back up your message and the behavior change that you want people to make. So, for example, if your strategic objective was to cut the number of birth defects, and what you wanted was to get pregnant women to take folic acid, you would have as your takeaway message, take folic acid, and your supporting information would be statistical about the difference in incidence of birth defects before and after. Distribution channels and evaluation we've talked about. So, behavior. Decide what you want them to do. Designing your message. This is the most important bit. And this is the difficult bit. You have to know your audience before you can design a message. You have to know about their prejudices, their interests, their knowledge. You have to know about that young man, and that his view is that he is not a drunk driver. But his interests are going drinking with his mates and being sociable. The audience must identify with the message. So it can't be, as the lady over there said, too graphic. You know, if you're a smoker and you only smoke at weekends, and the government shows you messages which are appallingly diseased lungs, you're not going to identify with it. You're going to say, that's not for me, that's for somebody who smokes 40 a day. I only smoke 2 cigarettes at the weekend. You know, show me something else. So you have to have a message that your audience is going to feel is relevant to them. And that takes us neatly on to WIIFM. What's in it for me? Which is a form of identification. So in other words, what benefit does your audience get from doing what it is you want them to do? Now, for social protection, this is particularly important, because whoever it is you're addressing, whoever's behaviours you're trying to change, be it the policymaker or the woman or the employer, you have to know what's in it for them so you can tell them. And that's what they will identify with. Now, the tagline is just something that sums it up in a memorable fashion. And in the ad we just saw, it's like, don't be a bloody idiot. And be prepared to adapt or die. You're all familiar with the phrase adapt or die. If your situation changes, you need to change your message. Again, to talk about the drink driving ad, probably when they started out, they thought they were talking to people who drank and drove, sorry. After they'd done a little bit more research, they probably worked out that actually it was a very, very small group of people who were doing most of it. Maybe some of the people who drank and drive had been discouraged and had got the original message. But this small group, who didn't consider themselves drunken drivers, didn't get the message. So you have to change it from don't drink and drive to be a couple of drinks can make a difference. You don't have to be a drunk driver to kill somebody. It's tough when you're working in the UN to tell people that their messages have to be clear, concise, consistent, compelling and convincing, because we're not very well known for writing in short sentences or using short words. But here we are. That's possibly why some of our messages don't get through in the way they should. But your messages should. And if you're going to speak to a big audience, you have to be clear. And that means no jargon. Jargon is for your internal communication, but when you're speaking outside your group, no jargon. Concise. People don't remember long messages. If you're doing a PSA, it should be 30 seconds or less. If you're going to pitch to a minister, you've probably got a couple of minutes before his attention wanders to something else, or she starts thinking about her next meeting. Consistent. If you repeat your message often, it means you're consistent. It doesn't mean you're boring. It means what you say is correct and you believe it in your heart. And that means other people will start to believe it too. Compelling. That means that it can't just be words. It has to have a message behind it. It has to be concrete. It has to say something. And there are many ways to convince people with your messages. It can be by telling the stories of other people for whom this has worked, or it can be by using data that proves your case. But if you need to remember those 5 C's. Clear, concise, consistent, compelling, and convincing when you're trying to design a message. When you're messaging people like policymakers, where you can give a slightly more sophisticated message, you can support it in slightly more detail. And the 3 parts that should go together when you try and construct a message for people like that, something they take away. You need to talk about the problem or the position that people are uncovered and they don't have social protection, or that the economy needs a stabilizer. You need to provide evidence that your way of going forward is going to work, and you need to show what the solution is. Now that was one distribution channel that we showed there. That was just a PSA that would have gone out mostly on TV probably. But you have a lot of distribution channels for your different messages, depending on who you want to reach and what they're saying. You can use the internet if your target audience has good internet connectivity. The good news is you control the content, and after you've started up, it doesn't cost much. You can also reach a lot of people if your target audience is on the internet. But it does require marketing. It doesn't happen by itself unless you're very, very lucky. You can use stakeholders to carry your messages to you, and that's great too. They can get right down to the grassroots, but that really does depend on your content and your contacts. And once you have given out the information, you no longer control it. It can be distorted, or it can be used for other people's purposes. That may not matter to you. It depends what you're trying to say. And you can use the media. Funny enough, in a lot of countries, having stories in the media actually adds credibility, because it's like a third-party endorsement. In some countries, obviously, people don't trust the media. But in countries where they do, it can be very useful. It doesn't cost much, because we're assuming you're not buying advertising, but it takes time, because you need somebody to talk to the journalist, to pitch to the journalist, to provide them with information, because generally speaking, the media don't do that for themselves. So if you're low on cash, but you've got a lot of people, that may work well for you. But once again, you don't control the content. They do. You can give them the information, but you can't decide what it is they do with it. Now, there are a number of different communication products that you can consider when you're selling social protection. Videos we've looked at. The great thing is, as you saw, they're very compelling if they're well made. And they can spread by themselves. You put them on YouTube, think how many people go on YouTube every day and watch your stuff. And people send it from a friend to a friend. It can go viral. However, good ones are expensive. And they need professional people to make them for you. Radio is great in some countries. The distribution is a lot cheaper than TV. But again, there can be language issues. If you're in a country where there are a lot of different languages, that can be difficult. And it also needs equipment, both for you and for the people at the other end. Leaflets are good if you're trying to get out complex information, like for example about perhaps a health insurance scheme. People may want to go back and refer to it again and again, talk to it among their friends. But for young people, they may not be very exciting. For older people, they're probably fine. Posters are the same. Like leaflets, they're very cheap, and they're good for complex information, where you might want to use them perhaps as part of an education package. But they don't last long, because paper doesn't. and people may not regard them as very exciting. Social media is very fashionable, and it's great, but it's only suitable for specific kinds of messages. Think of Twitter, it's 140 characters. So there's not a lot you can say in that. It is exciting, it's got a buzz around it, and it can be cheap, although you have to employ somebody who knows what they're doing. But the people you're going to reach are quite limited. They need to be people with smartphones, with good connectivity. And you need people to monitor it. So, again, it's cheap on running costs, but maybe not cheap on startup costs. Now, when you're doing your promotional work, you'll probably need more than one of these channels. For example, it's quite common to have a video backed by leaflets or by posters, or radio and social media working together. So you can consider a mixture.